The 31st Precinct sat on the corner of Halcyon Avenue and Drummond Street like a man who had long ago stopped caring what anyone thought of him, heavy gray and utterly sure of itself in the way that only institutions built with public money and minimal accountability ever managed to be. From the outside, if you drove past on a Tuesday morning with your windows up and your coffee in the cup holder, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A functioning police precinct in a well-funded district, the kind of place that inspired confidence in people who had never needed to be afraid of it. The brick facade was solid. The patrol cars in the lot gleamed in the autumn light. The crime statistics for the Halcyon Heights district, published quarterly on the city's public safety website, were the envy of every other precinct commander in the city. Low violent crime, high clearance rates, responsive community outreach. On paper, the 31st was a crown jewel. But paper is patient and paper will hold whatever you write on it. 3 of the overhead lights in the back parking lot had been burned out for 4 months. Nobody had filed a maintenance request, not because they didn't notice, but because filing maintenance requests was the kind of thing rookies did before they learned that certain things at the 31st simply did not get fixed, and pointing out that they needed fixing was a way of quietly marking yourself as someone who didn't understand how things worked here. The American flag mounted above the main entrance had been sun-bleached to a shade of pale pink and was fraying at the lower corner, flapping weakly in the October breeze. It had been that way since August. Nobody had replaced it. Inside, the precinct smelled the way all precincts smell: industrial floor cleaner and burnt coffee, and the particular staleness of a building where the same air has been recycled through the same vents for 30 years. But beneath that familiar institutional smell, if you had been in enough precincts in your career to know the difference, there was something else. Something tighter. The smell of a place where people were careful about what they said out loud and where they said it and who was standing close enough to hear. The Halcyon Heights district the 31st served was split down its middle by geography, and by everything geography means in an American city. The ridge sat on elevated ground in the north, wide residential streets lined with oak trees and Victorian homes, boutique retail corridors, wine bars, a farmer's market on Saturdays, and property values that had tripled in 12 years. The flats spread out below 3 miles of working-class neighborhoods that had been systematically, call it, deliberately, structurally underserved for decades, where the houses were smaller and closer together, and the nearest grocery store required a bus transfer, and where the relationship between the community and the officers of the 31st Precinct had calcified over years, and incidents and complaints filed, and complaints lost into something that was no longer surprise or outrage, but simply the low, steady weight of expectation. In the last 14 months, 3 black officers assigned to the 31st had formally requested internal transfers. The paperwork on all 3 requests had been routed through the Professional Standards Board, which was administered by Deputy Chief Warren Cole, and all 3 requests were still technically, procedurally, bureaucratically pending. Nobody talked about that either. In the lobby of the 31st, beside the front desk and across from the duty roster board, there hung a long row of framed photographs every commanding officer of the 31st Precinct since 1971. 22 frames, 22 faces, all of them white, all of them men. The frames were arranged in chronological order, each one centered neatly on a small brass nameplate. And at the very end of the row, past the last photo, there was one final frame the same size as all the others with a brass nameplate already installed, and the glass in the frame was empty. It had been empty for 11 days waiting. At 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, the locker room of the 31st Precinct was loud in the way locker rooms always are before a shift. Metal doors clanging. The hiss of a shower someone hadn't turned off all the way. The particular overlapping noise of men getting ready in a small space and talking over each other without listening, and at the center of it, sitting on the long wooden bench that ran down the middle of the room, with one boot on and one boot off, and 3 younger officers arranged around him with the attentive posture of people who have learned that paying attention is cheaper than being noticed. Not paying attention was Officer Craig Bellamy, and he was in the middle of a story. The story was about last Thursday. In Bellamy's telling, it was a story about good police work, sharp instincts, quick action, a potential threat identified and neutralized before anything could escalate. He told it with the practiced ease of a man who has told it several times already and gotten good at the parts that land leaning forward on the bench and using his hands and pausing at the right moments for the reactions he knew were coming. But the details kept slipping out around the edges of the story, the way they always do when someone is performing a version of events rather than remembering them. And if you listened to the details rather than the frame, the story was actually about a 17-year-old kid named Devin who had been walking home from his shift at the grocery store at 9:45 in the evening, carrying a backpack full of textbooks and wearing a hoodie. Because it was October and cold, and who had been walking along Meridian Street in the flats, walking on the sidewalk, not running, not doing anything, except existing in a place where Craig Bellamy had decided his presence required investigation, and who had ended up on the ground with his hands behind his back, for what Bellamy described as furtive movements. But what the 3 people who had witnessed it from the convenience store doorway across the street described in statements that went nowhere, as the natural, startled reaction of a teenager who suddenly had a flashlight in his face and a man in a uniform screaming at him. Devin had been released without charges. He had walked the rest of the way home, and his mother had sat with him at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning because he couldn't stop shaking, and neither of them had filed a complaint because they already knew what filing a complaint at the 31st produced, which was nothing. And Devin had gone back to work on Friday and hadn't worn his hoodie since. None of that was in Bellamy's story. In Bellamy's story, he had protected the neighborhood. 2 of the 3 officers listening laughed at the right moments and nodded at the right moments and gave Bellamy the validation he needed, which cost them nothing right now, and which they told themselves in the private, quiet part of themselves, where the accounting happens, they would somehow balance out later. The 3rd officer, Danny Kowalski, 26 years old and 6 months out of the academy, sat on the bench near the lockers and looked at his boots and said nothing, which was a different kind of choice, and one that had its own cost, though he hadn't fully calculated it yet. Craig Bellamy was 35 years old, medium height, but built thick through the chest and shoulders with a high and tight haircut that he maintained with the same regularity he gave to the shine on his tactical boots and the positioning of his badge on his uniform shirt. He adjusted the badge now in front of the narrow mirror above the sink, tilting it slightly so that the light caught it at a better angle. And then he looked at his own reflection for just a moment longer than a man checking his uniform would need to, which was a small thing, but was also, in its own way, the whole story. He was the nephew of Deputy Chief Warren Cole, and he had been a police officer at the 31st Precinct for 7 years, and in those 7 years he had accumulated 3 use-of-force complaints. 1 formal excessive force allegation from a 19-year-old black woman named Kezia Armstrong, who had been driving home from her nursing shift at 2 in the morning and had ended up with her face pressed against the hood of her car for 7 minutes for no reason she was ever given. And 1 informal complaint from a flat's business owner who had been told very clearly and very quietly that pursuing the complaint would create complications for his liquor license renewal. The excessive force allegation from Kezia Armstrong had been reviewed by the Professional Standards Board, which was administered by Deputy Chief Warren Cole, and it had been found to be the word used was unsubstantiated. A word that does a particular kind of work in particular kinds of institutions, the kind of work that looks like a finding but is actually a door being closed, and it had been filed and had not affected Bellamy's record in any measurable way. Everyone at the 31st knew about Bellamy's uncle. They knew it the way you know about weather, not something you talk about, just something you account for when you're deciding what to do, which directions to walk, what to say out loud, and what to keep internal. Bellamy finished tying his second boot, stood up, rolled his shoulders, and told Kowalski it was time to roll. Kowalski stood without a word, clipped his body camera to his chest, and followed his training officer out of the locker room and down the hall and out into the parking lot where cruiser 2209 was waiting, and Bellamy climbed in on the passenger side. Because on this particular morning he wasn't scheduled to drive, and he settled into the seat and put his elbow on the window frame and looked out at Halcyon Heights spread out before him, with the comfortable proprietary satisfaction of a man surveying land that he has always believed on some unexamined but deeply held level belongs to him. The October light was clean and cold. It was going to be a good day. At 6:30 that same morning, in the kitchen of a second-floor apartment 12 blocks from the 31st precinct, Captain Nadia Monroe was standing at the counter in jeans and a cable-knit sweater, drinking her second cup of coffee, and reading a personnel file she had already read 4 times. The file was 47 pages long. She had printed it herself 3 weeks ago after Commissioner Park had given her the assignment and the access code, and she had read it the first time sitting at her own dining room table at 11 o'clock at night with a yellow highlighter, and the second time on the train, and the third time in a coffee shop 2 blocks from headquarters while she waited for a meeting, making notes in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. This 4th reading was different from the other 3, slower, more deliberate, less about absorbing information, and more about letting it settle the way you read something a final time before you have to act on it. It was the personnel file of Officer Craig Bellamy. Nadia Monroe was 47 years old and had been a police officer for 22 years, which meant she had been a police officer since she was 25, which meant she had given more of her adult life to this institution than she had kept for herself. A fact she thought about sometimes, but not with regret. Only with the particular clear-eyed understanding of someone who made a choice a long time ago and has had enough evidence since to know it was the right one even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. She had started as a beat cop in the 9th District, which was the kind of neighborhood that got described in departmental briefings as high risk and high need, and in the local papers as troubled and embattled, and which was actually a community of working families and small businesses and people who loved their children and wanted the same things everyone wants, and who also happened to live in a neighborhood that had been underinvested in for decades, where the infrastructure was older, and the schools were more crowded, and the police presence was heavier and less accountable than anywhere else in the city. She had spent 4 years walking those streets before she made detective, and in those 4 years she had learned more about actual policing, about what it required, about what it cost, about what it was supposed to be, and how far the distance could be between the ideal and the reality, than she had learned in any classroom. She had made homicide at 29. In her first year, she closed 6 cases. In her best year, she closed 11, which was a number that people in the department cited quietly and without a lot of fanfare. Because publicly celebrating a black woman's performance in a division that had not historically welcomed black women was the kind of thing that made certain people uncomfortable, and the culture of the department at that time tended to accommodate discomfort in certain directions more readily than in others. She had survived 2 commanding officers who had tried to manage her into obscurity, one who assigned her exclusively to cold cases for 14 months, and one who had written in her annual evaluation that she demonstrated difficulty integrating with the unit's culture, which was the kind of language that meant something specific and was designed to mean it while being unprovable. And she had survived both of them by doing her job better than anyone around her, by documenting everything, by building allies carefully and selectively, and by being in the long run simply too good at what she did to be quietly disappeared. Commissioner Elaine Park had called her 6 weeks ago. The conversation had been brief and direct in the way that important conversations sometimes are, when the person making the request already knows the answer and is really asking something more than a question. The 31st was a problem that had been building for years. The complaints from residents of the flats, racial profiling, excessive force, civil rights violations, had been accumulating in a file that the DOJ had been reviewing for 18 months. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been building a case against Deputy Chief Warren Cole, who had been protecting the 31st's bad actors from consequence for a decade, and who had in doing so become deeply entangled in what the federal investigators believed was a genuine pattern of civil rights deprivation that rose to the level of federal criminal exposure. The problem was that the evidence against Cole was strong but not complete. The financial trail was there. The pattern of buried complaints was documented. What the FBI needed was Cole committing obstruction in real time on record in response to a legitimate civil rights action, a moment where his instinct to protect his network overrode his judgment enough to make him the instrument of his own destruction. Commissioner Park needed someone to command the 31st, someone credible enough that any action she took against the precinct's bad actors would be procedurally unassailable. Someone with the kind of record that couldn't be dismissed or undermined. Someone who would not flinch when Cole came at her. And Cole, they both knew, would absolutely come. "That's you, Nadia," the commissioner had said, and it wasn't a question. What the commissioner didn't know what Nadia hadn't told her because it wasn't something that affected the assignment, and it wasn't something she offered up easily, was that Nadia had a personal reason for saying yes that ran deeper than career and deeper than justice as an abstract principle. Her younger brother Marcus had been 22 when it happened. He had been driving home from a birthday dinner sober, careful obeying every traffic law with the specific, deliberate attention that young black men learn to give to traffic laws in this country because the cost of imperfection is not a ticket. 2 officers from the 7th Precinct had pulled him over for a lane change that he had made correctly with his signal on with adequate clearance. The stop had escalated in the way those stops escalate, in the incremental, procedurally covered way that makes them very difficult to prosecute after the fact. And by the end of it, Marcus had been yanked out of his car and put on the ground, and had the left side of his head pressed against the asphalt hard enough that he had lost partial hearing in his left ear, which he still had, which he would always have, which made a small but permanent static sound in his left ear that he described to Nadia when she had asked him about it once years later, as like someone left a television on in a room you can never quite get to. The 2 officers had received 5-day suspensions. They were both still on the force. Nadia had carried that knowledge in her chest every single day since. Not as rage she had learned a long time ago. That rage was a tool, not a fuel. And it had to be managed precisely or it would burn what you needed it to build. But as a specific, undiminished clarity about what the work was actually for. She closed the file. She rinsed her coffee cup. She went to her bedroom and changed into dark jogger pants, a faded university hoodie and washed-out navy blue-white sneakers, and pulled her hair back into a loose braid under a plain black baseball cap. She looked in the mirror. She looked like anyone. She looked like a woman running errands on a Tuesday, the way thousands of women in this city would be running errands on this Tuesday, unremarkable, anonymous, invisible, in the specific way that people are invisible when they look like they belong to the ordinary flow of daily life rather than to any institution with authority over it. She reached under the collar of her hoodie and clipped her gold captain's shield to the inner lining where it sat flush against the fleece, invisible from outside, accessible in 3 seconds if she needed it. She stood at her front door for a moment. On the wall beside it, in a simple wooden frame, was a photograph, her and Marcus at his college graduation, both of them, laughing at something off camera, his arm around her shoulder, her face tilted up toward his. She looked at the photograph for a long moment without performing anything for it. Then she opened the door and walked out into the October morning. She spent the first 2 hours of the morning walking, which is the oldest form of intelligence gathering there is, and also the most honest, because a neighborhood will tell you the truth about itself if you are willing to move through it at the pace of someone who lives there rather than the pace of someone passing through. She walked the flats, first moving through the grid of residential streets with her hands in her hoodie pocket, and her pace unhurried, reading what she saw with the practiced attention of a 22-year veteran who had learned to distinguish between what a neighborhood looks like and what it is actually doing. The streets were clean. The houses were modest but cared-for window boxes with the last of the season's flowers, small yards raked clear of leaves, a block association bulletin board outside the community center with flyers for a Halloween party, and a food bank drive and a meeting about the proposed rezoning that would affect 6 blocks of affordable housing on the south end. The neighborhood was alive in the particular quiet way that working neighborhoods are alive on a weekday morning when most of the adults are at jobs and most of the kids are at school. She watched a patrol car roll through an intersection 2 blocks ahead of her at about 6 miles an hour, slow enough to be seen, slow enough to be felt. And she watched the 2 people sitting on the steps of a house across the street register the car's presence without looking directly at it in the specific way that people learn to acknowledge authority without inviting it. The practiced peripheral awareness of people who have been taught by experience that direct eye contact with a slow-moving patrol car is a different kind of risk than no contact at all. The car continued past without stopping. The people on the steps didn't visibly relax, which was itself a kind of information they hadn't tensed, which meant the tension was already at its baseline. The constant low-level readiness that becomes so habitual, you stop experiencing it as tension and start experiencing it as just the way the air feels. She filed it, kept walking. On Beaumont Street, she watched a young black man. She put him at about 20, maybe 21, dressed for work in khakis and a pressed shirt, step off the sidewalk into the narrow strip of grass between the sidewalk and the curb as a white officer walked toward him on the same block. The officer didn't do anything. He didn't say anything. He just walked past with the occupied territory stride of someone who has never once adjusted his path for anyone. The young man stepped back onto the sidewalk after the officer passed and kept walking, his face entirely neutral. And there was something in that neutrality, in the practiced absence of any reaction at all, that was one of the saddest things Nadia had seen in a long time, because it meant the adjustment had been made so many times it was no longer conscious. It was just what you did on Beaumont Street on a Tuesday morning. You got out of the way. She noted the officer's badge number from 30 feet. She had a very good memory for numbers. She crossed the invisible line between the flats and the ridge around 10:15, and the shift was immediate and physical, in the way that economic geography always is. In American cities, the streets widened, the trees were older and larger, the sidewalks were newer concrete, the storefronts were brighter and better maintained and oriented toward a completely different set of needs and price points. A wine shop, a kitchen design studio, a boutique selling clothing whose prices would require a double take from anyone who shopped based on necessity rather than preference. And at the far end of Cartwright Avenue, anchoring the retail corridor, with the confident solidity of a building that has never doubted its own importance, was Holt & Wren. The store had been at the same address for 40 years, which was in this kind of neighborhood as much a statement of alignment as of longevity, a declaration that this establishment existed for a specific kind of customer and had no particular interest in expanding that definition. The facade was dark mahogany and brushed steel. The window displays were spare and deliberately lit to suggest that the objects inside them existed in a different category than ordinary merchandise, and the 2 small gold letters above the entrance were engraved rather than painted, because engraving was the kind of detail that mattered to the kind of customer Holt & Wren had always served. Retired Captain Lionel Grant was turning 70 in 8 days. He had been Nadia's first supervisor in homicide, a man who had believed in her work before she had fully believed in it herself, who had taught her how to read a case file and how to interview a witness who didn't want to talk, and how to survive in an institution that was sometimes more interested in protecting itself than in doing what it existed to do. He collected fountain pens, He had mentioned once in a way that Nadia had remembered, because she remembered almost everything that there was a particular Mont Blanc design he had been looking for but hadn't been able to find at a reasonable price. She knew Holt and Wren carried it. She had looked it up the previous week. She pushed through the heavy door and the outside world went quiet, replaced by the hushed acoustics of a space that had been designed to communicate at every sensory frequency that you had entered somewhere that took itself seriously. The air was cedar and expensive leather, and something floral and understated that probably had a French name. The lighting was warm and directional, falling on the glass cases at angles calculated to make their contents look like they were generating their own soft glow. Every surface was clean with the deep, particular cleanliness of places where cleanliness itself is part of what you're paying for. She felt the room change the moment she walked in. It was subtle the way these things always are when they're done by people who have practiced doing them without being called on it. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just a collective micro-adjustment in the posture of the people nearest to the entrance. A tightening, an increased alertness that was not the alertness of welcome. A security guard near the door touched his earpiece. A floor associate in a perfectly fitted black suit who had been arranging something on a nearby shelf stopped arranging and became still in the particular way that people become still when they are deciding what to do next. A clerk at the far jewelry counter looked up and then looked down and then looked up again. Nadia had navigated this specific room, this exact room with these exact walls and these exact faces, exchanged for different walls and different faces, her entire adult life. She had been a police officer for 22 years, a detective for 16 of those, a woman who had stood in crime scenes and interrogation rooms and courtrooms and had been in all of those places the most capable person present, and she still walked into this kind of room and felt the adjustment. The collective calculus of people deciding what category she belonged in, and she still. After all of it, had to make a conscious choice about how to carry herself through the door, which was a tax that was levied on her and not on other people. And she paid it every time without complaint and without making it anyone else's problem, because that was the only way to get where she needed to go. She crossed the floor to the accessories counter with steady, unhurried steps. The clerk there, a young man, maybe 23, with a name tag that said, Marcus straightened perceptibly, his expression cycling through something complicated before settling on professional caution. She asked calmly and specifically to see the Mont Blanc Meisterstück display. The specificity of the request visibly shifted something in Marcus Webb's posture. He relaxed fractionally in the way people relax when the information they receive resolves a question they were hoping would be resolved a certain way. She knew what she was asking for. She was here for something real. He reached for his keys. Outside on Cartwright Avenue cruiser, 2209 rolled to a stop at the curb. The morning had been slow in the way that made Craig Bellamy irritable. Not the good kind of slow, not the productive quiet of a shift where everything is orderly and under control, but the empty kind, the kind that felt like being benched, like the city was running without him, and not particularly noticing. He and Kowalski had been on patrol since 7:45, and in that time, they had responded to a fender bender on Ridgeline Road that turned out to be a non-event involving two middle-aged men who had already exchanged insurance cards and mostly wanted someone with a badge to confirm that the interaction was over, and they had driven twice through the Flats grid in a pattern Bellamy called maintaining presence, which Kowalski had come to understand meant driving slowly enough to be seen without stopping long enough to have a conversation. They had gotten coffee at the kiosk on Archer Street, and Bellamy had talked through most of the coffee break about a conversation he'd had with his uncle the previous weekend about the new deputy commissioner and what it meant for department politics, a conversation Kowalski had participated in by nodding at intervals and watching the street over Bellamy's shoulder. By 10:30, Bellamy was on his second coffee and his second cycle through a monologue about proactive policing that Kowalski had heard in various versions approximately 40 times in the 6 months they had been partners. The core of it never changed. Most cops reacted to crime, which meant by the time they showed up, the damage was already done, and only the exceptional officers, the ones with genuine instincts, the ones who understood what they were looking at before it became a problem, could get ahead of it. Pattern recognition was not profiling. It was skill. It was what separated the good ones from the administrators in uniform. Kowalski had stopped engaging with the argument directly around month 2. He had tried once to suggest that the pattern Bellamy described seemed to correlate more with race than with behavior, and Bellamy had looked at him with a particular expression. Not angry, just tired. The expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone who keeps missing the point, and had said that Kowalski was young and hadn't seen enough yet, which had the effect of making the argument about Kowalski's inexperience rather than the substance of what he'd said, and Kowalski had let it go, and he had been letting it go ever since. And every time he let it go, he could feel something shifting slightly in him, some internal calibration moving a degree in a direction he wasn't sure he wanted to go. They were idling on Cartwright Avenue Kowalski behind the wheel when Bellamy went quiet. Kowalski recognized the quality of the quiet. It was the focused quiet, the hunting quiet, and it was always preceded by Bellamy leaning slightly forward in his seat. And it always meant something was about to happen. He followed Bellamy's gaze to the floor-to-ceiling windows of Holt and Wren 50 feet ahead on the right. There was a woman inside leaning over the accessories counter looking at something under the glass. She was wearing a dark hoodie and jogger pants. She was black. She appeared to be somewhere in her mid to late 40s with a lean, upright posture and a baseball cap, and she was in conversation with the clerk at the counter pointing at something in the display case. She was doing nothing else. She was just there in a store looking at something she wanted to buy. "Watch this," Bellamy said, and he was already opening the door. Kowalski sat for a second, after the door closed, his hands still on the wheel, his coffee in the cup holder going cold. He had a clear view through the windshield. He could see Bellamy crossing the sidewalk toward the store entrance with that particular stride, not the measured, purposeful walk of an officer responding to a situation, but the proprietary walk of someone moving through space they believe they own. He got out of the car. As he crossed the sidewalk, he thought about the thing he always thought in these moments, which was that he would step in if it went too far, and which he had thought before, and which had not yet produced the intervention he kept promising himself. He pushed through the door into the cedar and leather quiet of Holt and Wren, and he took his position near the entrance, and he watched his training officer approach the woman at the counter from behind. The hand came down on her shoulder without warning, heavy and arresting. And from behind the way, authority announces itself when it is not interested in being questioned about whether the announcement was necessary. Nadia had heard the door. She had heard the particular quality of the footfall, the flat, deliberate thud of someone whose weight sits forward, who walks heel to toe with intention, and she had registered it as police before she turned, not because of anything she could have named in the moment, but because 22 years in law enforcement gives you an ear for it. The way musicians develop perfect pitch, a deep bodily recognition that bypasses cognition entirely. She turned slowly. She looked at the hand on her shoulder. First, large, pale, gripping too hard for the situation. The situation was then up along the arm to the uniform shirt. The badge, the name tag. Harrington. No. She read it twice. Bellamy. Badge number 4417. She moved up to the face, taking in all of it, the particular set of the jaw, the angle of the chin, the eyes doing the work that eyes do when they've already made a decision, and the conversation is just the paperwork on a conclusion that's been reached. She had seen that face many times. It had been wearing different faces, but she had always recognized it. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was level modulated, carrying no information beyond the question itself. Bellamy removed his hand from her shoulder with the leisurely deliberateness of a man completing a gesture rather than correcting one, which told her he didn't think the gesture had required correction. He stepped around to face her fully close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, positioning his body between her and the display case, in a way that was about ownership of space rather than anything else. "There might be," he said with the particular cadence of someone who enjoys the might be. "This is a high-end establishment. We've had some complaints in this area recently about merchandise going missing. You look like you've been spending some time at this counter." Marcus Webb, the clerk, straightened up from behind the case. He was young and he was nervous, but he was also right there and had been watching the interaction for the 6 seconds it had been happening, and those 6 seconds were enough to tell him that this was wrong. "Officer, she was just asking me to—" "I'll handle this." Bellamy didn't look at Marcus when he said it. He kept his eyes on Nadia and said it in the flat, factual way that people use when they want to communicate that the interruption is not being heard and will not be heard. Marcus stopped. He pulled his hands back from the counter. He looked at Nadia. She met his eyes briefly. Not for help, not performing distress, just the even acknowledging look of someone who wants him to know she sees him, and then she returned her attention to Bellamy. "I was asking the clerk to show me a fountain pen," she said. "I'm buying a retirement gift. I have every right to be here. That's what they all say." It came out so easily, so automatically, with such complete comfort, that it was clear it was something he said often, a reflexive response, one of several he kept on rotation. He tilted his head slightly to the right. "Step away from the counter, please. Let's have a conversation away from the glass. I don't need to step away from anything," she said. "I haven't done anything wrong. If you have a specific suspicion, state it clearly." The color rose in his neck just above the collar. She had seen that too, the specific flush of a man who is more accustomed to compliance than to this, to the clean, firm refusal to perform guilt in response to accusation. He looked around the store. The shoppers who had been nearby had gone, still scattered across the floor in small clusters, the way people go still when they want to watch something without appearing to watch it. A woman near the handbag display was holding her phone at her hip. A couple near the front had stopped moving entirely. Bellamy's eyes came back to Nadia, and what she saw in them when they came back had changed slightly. The annoyance was still there, but there was something underneath it now. Something harder. The particular expression of a man whose authority has been publicly questioned and who has decided that the question requires a definitive answer. He leaned in. He dropped his voice. He brought his face close enough to hers that only she would hear him clearly. And he said something that was not a police procedure, and was not a professional response, and was not anything other than what it was, a vicious, intimate racial epithet delivered with the casual fluency of someone for whom the word had never lost its utility. Nadia felt the word the way you feel, a slap, the physical impact of it landing, the immediate flare of something in her chest, the knowledge that what just happened was real and documented and final. She held his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not give him the reaction he was checking for, and she could see him check for it, the microsecond assessment of whether it had landed the way he wanted, and she gave him nothing except her eyes, steady and unreadable and completely unmoved, and she watched something harden in him at the absence of the response he expected. At the counter 4 feet away, Marcus Webb had heard it. His hand was already below the counter touching his phone. At the entrance, Danny Kowalski had heard it. Or he had heard enough of it, the shape of it, the single consonant that cut through the store's careful quiet. He took a half step forward. Then he stopped. Nadia was aware of Kowalski, had been aware of him since he came in, had clocked his body camera running and positioned correctly, had noted the specific quality of his discomfort. Not the discomfort of a man who disagreed with what was happening and was about to act on that disagreement, but the discomfort of a man who knew something was wrong and was deciding the way he apparently decided every time not yet. She thought about Devon, the 17-year-old kid on Meridian Street from Bellamy's locker room story, who had ended up on the ground for walking home from work. She thought about the woman on the steps of the building on Beaumont Street who had filed the excessive force complaint that had gone nowhere. She thought about her brother and the static sound in his left ear that he would carry for the rest of his life. She thought about every person in the flats who did not have a gold shield clipped to the lining of their clothes and who had to walk through encounters like this one with nothing to protect them except their own dignity and whatever luck they happened to be carrying. She did not reach into her hoodie. Bellamy grabbed her arm. He did it hard, the way you grab something you intend to move, and he twisted it behind her back in the practiced way of someone who has done this motion many times, and the pain was real and immediate, a sharp mechanical protest from her shoulder and wrist. A woman near the handbags made a small involuntary sound. The couple near the entrance had their phones out now, both of them held at angles that tried to look casual. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." He was already pulling the cuffs from his belt. "You have no probable cause," she said, and her voice was still level, though the pain was making it cost her something to keep it that way. "You have not identified any illegal merchandise. You have not observed any act of theft. You are in violation of the Fourth Amendment and the Patrol Guide, Section 4. Paragraph 2 governing procedures for suspected retail." "Save it for the judge," he said, and clicked the first cuff closed around her wrist. She was aware of Marcus Webb standing very still behind the counter with his phone at his hip, the camera facing outward, the small red light indicating it was running. She was aware of the people scattered across the floor of Holt and Wren, watching from behind their stillness, and she was aware that some of them were horrified, and some of them were merely spectating, and some of them would remember this for a very long time. She was aware that Kowalski's body camera had been running the entire time, and that it had audio, and that every word Bellamy had said, including the word he had leaned in and delivered in a whisper 3 feet from a functioning recording device, was now a permanent record. She let Bellamy click the second cuff closed. She felt the metal bite against her wrists. She held her head up. Bellamy stepped back, looked at the room with a brisk, satisfied nod, the nod of a man who has just completed a job and said something to the room that was designed to sound like an explanation and was actually a performance, something about public safety and department protocol and the importance of maintaining order in a high-end retail environment, and then he put his hand on Nadia's arm and began walking her toward the door. Marcus Webb watched them go. His phone was still recording. He had been running it since the moment Bellamy's hand came down on her shoulder because Marcus Webb had grown up in the flats and he had learned the same way everyone in the flats learned it, that in encounters like this one, the most important thing you could do was create a record. The back seat of a police cruiser is designed with very specific intentions, and none of them are comfort. The seat is hard, molded plastic angled slightly forward in a way that makes it difficult to sit back properly. And when your hands are cuffed behind you, the practical effect is that your entire ride is spent in a posture that communicates at a purely physical level, that you have been reduced to a body being transported rather than a person going somewhere. Nadia sat in the back of Cruiser 2209 and experienced the physics of this with the careful attention she gave to everything storing it, alongside everything else she had stored over the past 40 minutes. And she thought about all the people who had sat in this exact seat on this same hard plastic, with this same pressure in their wrists and no gold shield in their lining, and nothing to protect them except the knowledge that they hadn't done anything wrong, which in this particular precinct had historically proven to be no protection at all. In the front seat, Bellamy was talking. He had been talking since before the doors closed, already constructing the narrative, already rehearsing the version he would tell in the locker room, the version that would make the other officers laugh and confirm his self-image, and add another chapter to the ongoing story he told himself about who he was and what he was doing. In this version, he had spotted a potential shoplifter based on behavioral indicators, consistent with pre-theft assessment, had approached and made contact, had encountered resistance and verbal aggression, and had made a clean, justified, proactive arrest for attempted grand larceny and obstruction. In this version, he was sharp. He was effective. He was the thing he always believed himself to be. Kowalski was in the passenger seat looking out the window. His body turned slightly away from Bellamy in the small, practiced way of a man trying to minimize his target profile. Nadia had been watching Kowalski since the store. She had watched him take that half-step forward and stop, and she had made a specific note of both the step and the stopping, because the step told her something about who Kowalski was under the surface, and the stopping told her something about what the culture of this precinct had done to that person over 6 months of training under someone like Bellamy. She had seen this particular combination before. Not a bad person, but a person who had been trained to make a specific kind of calculation about when the right thing became worth the cost of doing it, and who hadn't yet found the version of events where the calculation came out the other way. She was going to give him one. "You are operating outside of departmental protocol," she said clearly into the interior of the car in the measured cadence of someone who wants to be heard and recorded and remembered. Section 4 of the Patrol Guide. Paragraph 2. Governing procedures for suspected retail theft in a retail environment requires that an officer establish reasonable articulable suspicion before initiating contact, which you did not do. It requires that you confirm with store management whether any theft was suspected or observed, which you did not do. It requires that you advise the subject of her Miranda rights before placing her in custody, which you have not done, and that you formally charge her with a specific crime before transport, which you have also not done. There was a beat of silence in the front of the car. Bellamy was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. She could almost hear him deciding whether to respond with contempt or ignore her. And he went with contempt because ignoring required more discipline than he typically exercised. He said something dismissive and mocking about her knowing the rule book so well, something that ended with, "Must watch a lot of TV," and it was funny. In the locker room key he was still operating in, and Kowalski produced a small obligatory approximation of a laugh that sounded like a man performing laughter rather than experiencing it. But Kowalski's neck had gone rigid the moment she began citing the patrol guide. She had watched it in the rearview mirror, the specific rigidity of someone who just heard something he wasn't supposed to hear, something that changed the shape of the situation he was in. Normal civilians didn't cite patrol guide section numbers with that precision. Normal civilians didn't cite them at all. Bellamy, high on the narrative he was constructing, apparently missed this or chose to miss it. Nadia watched the 31st Precinct building come into view through the rear window. The gray brick, the faded flag, the burned-out parking lot lights, and she thought about the fact that in 22 hours she was supposed to walk through the front door of that building in her Class A uniform and take command of it, and instead she was being driven into its back lot in handcuffs in the back of a cruiser belonging to a man who was going to carry that irony with him for whatever remained of his career, which was now measurable in hours rather than years. She looked at the building. She thought, my building. She kept her face neutral. She kept her back straight. She had been waiting a long time for this particular Tuesday, and it was going much better than she had planned. The Sallyport swallowed them, whole heavy steel doors rolling shut behind the cruiser, with the grinding definitive sound of a place designed to make endings feel permanent, and then there was the parking brake, the engine going quiet, the doors opening, and the cold concrete smell of the booking area coming in all at once, industrial and institutional, and very specifically, the smell of a building where people arrived in one condition and left in another. Bellamy came around the back of the cruiser and opened the door and pulled Nadia out with the same unnecessarily physical certainty he had applied to every interaction since the store, steering her through the steel double doors into the booking area with his hand on her arm like she was something he was carrying rather than someone he was walking beside. The booking area of the 31st was a long rectangular room under fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below. Conscious awareness, the kind of buzz you stop hearing after 10 minutes, but that sits in the back of your skull for the rest of the day. The floor was scuffed linoleum pale gray with darker patches where the finish had worn through to something older. There were two holding benches bolted to the wall on the left side, a row of filing cabinets along the right, a water cooler that sounded like it was considering complaining about something, and at the far end, raised on a low platform behind a heavy wooden desk, Sergeant Earl Briggs. Briggs was 54 years old and had been with the 31st Precinct for 25 of those years, and in those 25 years he had outlasted 4 commanding officers, 3 major departmental scandals, 2 rounds of budget cuts that had reduced his staff by a third, and 1 internal affairs investigation that had come within 6 feet of his desk before being redirected somewhere else. And he had done it by being in every situation exactly what the situation required him to be, and nothing more. And by keeping his head down with the consistency and dedication of a man who had decided somewhere. Around year 8 that keeping his head down was a form of survival, and had not yet been willing to examine whether it was also a form of something else. He was a black man who had spent 25 years in a precinct that rewarded a specific kind of deference, and the cost of that calculation was written in him somewhere below the surface in the particular quality of his tiredness, which was not the tiredness of a man who had worked hard, but the tiredness of a man who had worked hard at not seeing certain things, and not seeing certain things is in the long run a more exhausting kind of work. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee typing a shift report with 2 fingers when Bellamy came through the doors announcing himself the way he always announced himself, loud forward, filling the room with the footprint of his presence before the room had asked for it. "Got a live one for the cages," Sarge Bellamy said, pushing Nadia forward slightly so she stumbled the half-step against the edge of the desk. "Make some room. Attempted grand larceny. Casing the high-end cases at Holt & Wren resisted contact, and I will bet you my pension she's got a sheet." 2 officers at the water cooler had turned to look. One detective leaning against the filing cabinet straightened up. The normal background noise of the booking area had not stopped, but had changed register the particular quality of sound that occurs when a group of people simultaneously become more attentive without doing anything visible to indicate it. Briggs sighed the sigh of a man for whom the Monday of every week begins on Tuesday, and he hit the spacebar on his keyboard and reached for the intake form and looked up. She was standing on the other side of his desk, with her hands cuffed behind her and her posture rigidly, impossibly upright. Not the posture of someone shoring themselves up against a bad situation. Not the posture of false dignity performed under humiliation, but the natural, habitual posture of someone for whom standing straight was simply the default, the way very good soldiers and very experienced officers carry themselves because they have never needed anything from their posture except efficiency. She was in dark jogger pants and a navy hoodie and a baseball cap, and she was looking at him, and what Briggs noticed first, before anything else about her, was the quality of the look. Most of the people Harrington Bellamy brought in were in some state of agitation, and rightfully so, because being arrested is an agitating experience, and most of them were angry or scared or performing one of those things, and a few of them were calculating which was a specific kind of look you learned to recognize. This was none of those. This was something quieter and more total. This was the look of a person who was exactly where she expected to be, and was watching to see how the next several minutes would unfold, not with anxiety, but with the patient, calibrated attention of someone who has already accounted for the range of possible outcomes and is prepared for all of them. It was, Briggs would think later, the look of the most in-control person in the room. He looked at her for exactly 1.5 seconds. Then he looked at Bellamy, who was already resting his elbows on the counter and starting in on the story for the officers at the water cooler, voice loud and self-congratulatory. And then he looked back at the woman in handcuffs and reached across the desk for her wallet, which Bellamy had dumped on the counter a moment earlier, and he picked it up and opened it and slid the driver's license out of the clear plastic window. He looked at the small printed photograph on the license. Then he looked at her face. He looked at the name, Monroe Nadia R. The air in Briggs's chest departed with no particular urgency and simply did not come back. His eyes went involuntarily and immediately to the bulletin board mounted 3 feet to his right on the precinct wall, where it had been mounted for 11 days, where he had looked at it every single shift for 11 days without it carrying any particular weight, where it was still mounted now under a yellow highlighter mark that someone had added with what had seemed like unnecessary emphasis at the time, and which now seemed like the most necessary emphasis that had ever been applied to any document in the history of this building. Attention, all personnel effective. Wednesday, 0800 hours. The 31st Precinct will be under the command of Captain Nadia Monroe. All commanding officers and shift supervisors will be present for the formal change of command briefing. Briggs looked at the license. He looked at the bulletin board. He looked at the face of the woman standing on the other side of his desk in handcuffs, with her posture as straight as a plumb line, and her eyes on him with the patient, waiting quality of someone who has been watching this exact moment approach for the last hour and a half, and is in no hurry now that it has arrived. His heart had begun beating with the specific, irregular urgency of a man who has just realized he is standing in the middle of something that has been moving toward him for a long time. "Tommy," he said, and his voice came out smaller than he intended. What's the name? Billy Bellamy was still talking to the officers at the water cooler, grinning, performing the story. "Run her through NCIC. Let's see how long her sheet is. I want to get back out on the street before lunch." Briggs swallowed. He looked at the woman again. She had not moved, had not changed expression, had not done anything to indicate what he should do next, except exist there in front of him, with her hands cuffed and her eyes patient, and the specific quality of her stillness communicating without words that she knew everything he knew and was waiting to see what he was going to do with it. Tommy Briggs tried again, louder, and this time Bellamy turned. Sarge Briggs opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Bellamy standing there with the comfortable arrogance of a man who has never had a reason to check his own assumptions, and he looked at the bulletin board, and he looked at the license in his hand, and he said very carefully, as if each word was a step on ice he wasn't sure would hold, Did you verify her identification before you made the arrest?" "I got her wallet," Bellamy said, a mild edge of impatience entering his voice. "Why? What's in it?" And it was in that moment in the silence between Bellamy's question and whatever answer was coming that the woman in the handcuffs spoke for the first time since entering the building, and her voice did not carry the volume of someone making a scene or the pleading quality of someone asking for mercy, but the flat carrying authority of someone reading a statement into a record that she knows will matter, and what she said in the direction of Sergeant Briggs rather than Bellamy was very short and very precise. "Sergeant, I think you should look at the bulletin board." The room had gone quiet in stages, the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that nobody can quite see yet, but everyone can feel. The water cooler conversation had stopped first, then the detective by the filing cabinets, then the 2 patrolmen near the far door, until the booking area of the 31st Precinct had arrived at the particular dead stillness of a space holding its breath. Bellamy had turned around fully now, his initial impatience shifting into something more wary as he read the quality of Briggs's face, which had gone a specific shade of pale that Bellamy had never seen on Briggs before. The shade of pale that appears on people who have just realized the thing they are holding is not what they thought it was. What Bellamy said. "What is it?" Briggs didn't answer. He was still looking at the license. His hands had developed a faint tremor. Nadia stood between them and said calmly to no one in particular, "Officer Bellamy, I need you to reach into the inner lining of my hoodie, the left inside pocket, through the neck opening, and pull out what you find there." Bellamy looked at her. The wariness was moving into something more complicated now, a processing kind of expression, and for a moment Nadia could almost see him running through the options. Was this a trick? Was she carrying something? Was this some legal maneuver she was setting up? And she watched him land, as arrogant people always land on the option. That was most consistent with the narrative he was already in, which was that she was still the subject and he was still in control, and whatever was in the pocket was probably nothing, and the fastest way to prove that and close this loop was to just do it. He stepped toward her. He reached up with one hand awkwardly, finding the neck of the hoodie, and reached his fingers inside against the fleece lining and moved them until they found something in the left interior and closed around it and pulled it out. It was a leather case about the size of a standard wallet, but thicker with a magnetic closure. He held it in his hand for a moment looking at it, and there was a second there, a full second that seemed longer, that the watching room seemed to stretch out to accommodate where his expression was still calculating, still somewhere in the territory of this is manageable. And then he flipped the magnetic closure open. The fluorescent lights of the 31st Precinct's booking area fell on polished gold. Not silver, the silver of a patrolman's star that could have been contested, could have been argued about, could have been processed under the protective layer of Bellamy's certainty. Gold. The deep, warm, unambiguous gold of a senior command badge with the city seal in the center, and the eagle across the top with its wings spread in the specific posture that appears only on the shields of people who have earned the rank to carry it, and below the eagle pressed into the leather in stamped gold letters, Captain Commanding Officer. And below that, on the ID card in the adjacent window, a photograph and a name. Monroe Nadia R., Captain 31st Precinct. The badge wallet fell from Bellamy's fingers. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, clean crack that the entire room heard, a sound that carried in the dead air of the space like the report of something much larger, and the sound of it seemed to keep going after the wallet had stopped moving, reverberating in the walls and the ceiling and the memory of everyone present. Bellamy stood above it. His face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in approximately 2 seconds, the blankness of first contact with information that doesn't fit, then the rapid cycling of a mind, attempting alternative explanations, then the arrival at the expression that replaced everything else, which was fear undiluted and total. The fear of a man who has been speeding for a very long time and has just felt the car leave the road. "She," he said. He stopped. He started again. She must have. He stopped again. There are moments in human interactions where a person says the thing they did not mean to say, the thing their unexamined beliefs produce in the absence of any more sophisticated filter. The thing that is so automatic and so deeply embedded that stress eliminates the thin membrane that usually keeps it just below the surface. "She stole it," Bellamy said. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. Nadia let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. She let the words sit in the air of the room and be heard by everyone who was there. And she let the implications of the words, "a black woman in a hoodie couldn't be a police captain, so she must be a thief," settle into the consciousness of every witness present, and she watched the understanding of what Bellamy had just revealed about himself move through the room like a current. Then Sergeant Earl Briggs came around the booking desk. His knees were visibly unsteady. He had to make 3 attempts to get the small handcuff key into the lock, because his hands would not hold steady 3 attempts while the room watched and the reality of the situation assembled itself in the air above all of them, and on the 3rd attempt the key found the slot and the cuffs fell open with a click, and Nadia brought her arms forward slowly, rolling her shoulders, rubbing the marks on her wrists. She bent down and picked up the badge wallet. She dusted it with 2 fingers, a small, precise motion, and clipped it to the collar of her hoodie. Gold on faded navy blue. She let it be seen. She stood in the center of the booking area of the 31st Precinct with her captain's shield clipped to the collar of her hoodie and her wrists carrying the reddened marks of handcuffs that had been on them for the last 35 minutes, and she did not perform anything. Not anger, not triumph, not the satisfaction of the reversal. None of the things the room was perhaps waiting for, but simply stood and looked at the assembled officers with the patience of a woman who knows she has as much time as the situation requires. Then she turned to Kowalski. He was still near the double doors, and he had not moved since the badge wallet hit the floor, and what was happening in his face was something more complicated than fear. It was the specific expression of a young man watching. The moment he has been dreading and privately preparing for arrive, and finding that he is exactly as unready for it as he feared, and that it doesn't matter anymore because it is here. Officer Kowalski. Her voice was not unkind. It was direct the way a compass is direct, not hard, just accurate. Your body camera has been running since before we entered Holt and Wren. I need you to answer 3 questions on the record in this room. Do you understand? Yes, Captain Kowalski said. His voice was barely above a conversational level, but it was steady, which told her something about who he was under the 6 months of what the 31st had been doing to him. Did I, at any point during the interaction at Holt and Wren, display behavior that constituted reasonable, articulable suspicion of any crime? Kowalski's eyes went briefly to Bellamy. She watched him make the calculation, watched him feel the weight of what he was being asked to step over, and watched him step over it. No, Captain. You did not. Did I resist at any point during the arrest? No, Captain. Who initiated the stop without cause, without communicating with store management, and without establishing any evidence of potential criminal activity. A full beat of silence. She let it stretch. She did not rush him. Officer Bellamy did, Kowalski said, and his voice was louder on this answer, as if saying the true thing clearly required slightly more energy than saying it quietly, the way something locked releases with more force than it was held with. What happened next happened fast. Bellamy spun toward Kowalski with a word that was more sound than language, a snarling, betrayed syllable. And Nadia spoke one word in a register she had almost never needed to use in 22 years because she had almost never been in a situation where one word at that volume and in that frequency was appropriate. The word was officer. One word. But it landed on Craig Bellamy like a physical thing, and he stopped turning, and he stopped making the sound, and he turned back toward her instead. And, for the first time since the store in the fluorescent-lit booking area of the precinct he had been treating as his personal kingdom for 7 years, he was looking at her without a single layer of the protective certainty that had been there since the beginning, and what was left without it was just a man of 35 who had run out of moves and knew it. I am officially assuming command of the 31st Precinct, Nadia said, speaking to the room, not to Bellamy specifically, because this was not for Bellamy. Effective this moment, 36 hours ahead of the scheduled transition. Sergeant Briggs, note the time and date in the official log. Yes, Captain Briggs said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not just procedural compliance, but the specific quality of a man who has been waiting without knowing. He was waiting for something to change, and is feeling the first actual breath of changed air that told her something about him she would remember. She turned back to Bellamy. Your service weapon, she said, and your badge. He didn't move for a moment. He was running something internal. She could see it, the last-ditch calculation, the inventory of options, and she watched him reach the end of the inventory and find it empty and come back to her with nothing left to calculate with. His hands went to his gun belt. They were shaking with the fine, high-frequency tremor of a man whose adrenaline has tipped from aggression into something closer to the physiological state of a trapped animal, and he unsnapped the holster and lifted out his service weapon with the careful mechanical movements of someone performing a task they never expected to perform, and laid it on the booking desk. Then he reached up to his shirt and unpinned his badge. His silver star, 7 years of authority reduced in this motion to an object being placed on a surface, and laid it next to the gun. Sergeant Briggs, Nadia said, and her voice had not raised an inch from its baseline the entire time. Please show Officer Bellamy to holding cell 3, pending formal processing for unlawful arrest, assault under color of authority, deprivation of civil rights, and official misconduct. Bellamy's head came up sharply. His mouth opened. "You wanted to put someone in a holding cell today," Craig Nadia said, and there was nothing in her voice except the clean, factual weight of consequence being delivered to someone who never expected to be on this side of it. "You're going to get that experience." The women's locker room assigned to command staff was on the second floor, small, clean, rarely used, with a single locker assigned to the commanding officer and a narrow mirror above the sink and a single overhead light that worked, and Nadia stood in front of the mirror in the quiet of it and looked at herself for a moment before she opened the locker. The hoodie, the jogger pants, the baseball cap, the clothes of someone who had moved through Halcyon Heights that morning as an ordinary person without the protection of rank or the authority of a uniform, and who had experienced the full weight of how the 31st Precinct operated when it thought no one important was watching. She hung the hoodie on the locker hook. She reached in and took out the garment bag she had placed there at 7:15 that morning, when she had come in through the building's rear entrance before the shift change, using the access code Commissioner Park had given her. She unzipped the bag. The Class A uniform was pressed to precision. The navy blue fabric had the particular quality of a uniform that has been worn seriously for a long time. Not stiff and ceremonial, but broken in at the right places, worn with familiarity rather than performance. She dressed slowly and with care, buttoning each button, straightening each line, pinning the twin gold bars of her captain's rank to her collar, with the small, practiced motion of someone who has done this enough times that the gesture is automatic but has not yet lost its meaning. She transferred her shield from the lining of the hoodie and clipped it over her heart. She looked at herself in the mirror. Then she reached up to her lapel and confirmed that the small microphone clipped there, which looked to any casual inspection like the standard issue communications mic that all officers wore on their left collar, was transmitting. She pressed a single button on the receiver on her hip and waited. "Still with you," said the voice on the secure federal channel, Agent Diane Forsyth, FBI Public Corruption Unit, who had been listening since 8 that morning, who was currently parked in an unmarked vehicle 3 blocks from the 31st with 4 federal agents and a warrant that had been sealed and ready for 48 hours. That was everything we needed from the store and the transport. Audio is clean on all of it, including what he said at the counter, including exactly that. Crystal clear. Our tech already has it isolated and confirmed." A brief pause. "You all right?" It was a question that required a slightly longer answer than the situation had time for, so Nadia compressed it into the truthful part. "I'm operational. Cole is already on his way. He got the call from his nephew 15 minutes ago. We clocked the phone call. ETA to the precinct is somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. Nadia looked at her reflection in the locker room mirror and thought about 18 months of federal case building, about the financial trail and the shell accounts and the 11 buried complaints and the 2 officers reassigned as retaliation for reporting misconduct, about the careful, intricate preparation of a trap that had needed one specific element to close it. Deputy Chief Warren Cole arriving at the 31st Precinct and doing exactly what he always did, which was using his authority to make a problem disappear. Except that this time the problem was a federal civil rights arrest that had been conducted by a federal agent operating undercover as a police captain in a room full of witnesses, with every word going out on a secure federal frequency. The trap had been in place for a long time. What Craig Bellamy had provided this morning at Holt and Wren without any planning or knowledge or intention was the trigger. She had known when she reviewed Bellamy's file in the weeks before assuming command that he was the most visible instrument of Cole's network at the 31st, the most active, the most protected, the most consistent in his behavior, and therefore the most reliable. If she moved against him on a legitimate civil rights charge, Cole's instinct would be to intervene, because Cole had been intervening in exactly these situations for a decade, and it had always worked. And the dangerous thing about a track record of impunity is that it makes you overconfident in the tools that created it. She had not engineered what happened at Holt and Wren. She had not staged Bellamy's behavior or manipulated his choices. What she had done was show up in plain clothes in the neighborhood where he operated and be exactly who she was, which was a black woman in casual clothes in an expensive store. And she had trusted on the basis of a 7-year record documented in 47 pages that Craig Bellamy would do exactly what Craig Bellamy always did. He had done exactly what Craig Bellamy always did. And now Warren Cole was 12 minutes away. "Let him come," she said into the mic. "Let him make the call." "We'll be at the door when it's time," Forsyth said. Nadia checked the uniform one final time in the mirror, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the locker room and down the stairs and into the booking area where a precinct full of officers was waiting to see what happened next. 43 minutes after Bellamy's call, the front doors of the 31st Precinct opened, the way front doors open when someone important is arriving, both panels at the same time, as if the building itself was acknowledging the rank of the person entering it. Deputy Chief Warren Cole walked in, like a man who had been entering rooms this way for 30 years, which he had. He was 58, broad through the chest, with the particular kind of solidity that authority and good tailoring produce together. His silver hair brushed back from a face that was currently the specific deep red of someone who has been interrupted at dinner by news that required the interruption, but which he was going to make sure everyone knew was inconvenient. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost what a junior officer made in a month because he had been attending dinners with important people for a long time and had long ago stopped noticing how much his clothes cost. 3 aides came through the door behind him, moving at the pace of people whose job is to keep up. The precinct lobby went quiet. The desk officers, the clerks, the patrolmen waiting for a form to come through the printer. All of them went still in the particular way that subordinates go still. When someone with that much institutional power walks into a room, the reflexive attentiveness of people who have learned through years of evidence that being in the field of view of Warren Cole during one of his moods was a situation that required managed invisibility. Sergeant Cole's voice hit the room at a volume that was designed for larger spaces. "Where is my nephew, and who the hell authorized his detainment?" Sergeant Briggs at his desk opened his mouth. "Officer Bellamy is in holding cell 3, said a voice from the landing above the squad room. "And I authorized his detainment." Cole looked up. Nadia was at the top of the short staircase that overlooked the floor, in full Class A uniform, gold bars, gleaming shield over her heart, and she descended the stairs with the measured, deliberate pace of someone for whom every step is a choice. Cole watched her come down. He knew her name. He had known it since the commissioner's announcement 3 weeks ago, had known it in the specific way you know the name of a threat you intend to manage before it becomes a problem, which was why he had been working through channels for the past 3 weeks to have the assignment reviewed and potentially redirected a process that had not produced results in time. He had assessed her in the way he assessed everyone through the lens of what they could do to him and how much protection he had against it, and he had concluded that she was ambitious, credentialed, and capable of being difficult, but that the existing infrastructure of the 31st, the relationships, the patterns, the mechanisms of protection that had been in place for a decade would blunt any reform effort in the way that existing infrastructure always blunted reform efforts through the quiet, grinding resistance of people invested in the existing order. He had not accounted for 47 minutes in which she had been running a federal operation that his nephew had activated by grabbing a woman in a luxury store. He filled himself to his full authority, which was considerable, and he stepped forward and looked at her with the confidence of a man who had been doing this for 30 years, to people with much more leverage than she had. "Read Monroe. Whoever you are, you have committed an extraordinary error of judgment. My nephew is a 7-year veteran of this department with a clear record. You have detained him without cause. You have almost certainly violated half a dozen procedural requirements, and you have done it in a way that is going to be extremely visible and extremely difficult to recover from. I am giving you a direct lawful order as Deputy Chief of this department, release Officer Bellamy from holding. Wipe the booking log for today's incident and turn in your command shield. You are suspended pending immediate review." Nadia stood in front of him and said nothing for a moment. She had been listening with the attentive patience of a very good investigator to the specific words he was using, and she was satisfied with them. Then she said quietly, "Your nephew targeted me because I am a black woman in a wealthy neighborhood. He assaulted me, deprived me of my liberty without cause, and he did it because the culture of this precinct, the culture you built and maintained and protected, told him that he would never face consequences for it. He has been doing versions of this for 7 years to people who did not have a badge in their pocket to pull out. Those people filed complaints. You buried them. You transferred the officers who reported the misconduct. You allowed it to keep happening because it suited the network you were running, and you were able to do all of that because the people your nephew hurt didn't have enough institutional power to make the accountability stick." Cole's jaw had tightened progressively through this. He stepped closer. He was very large, and he was used to proximity working as a form of pressure. "You're making very serious accusations." "Captain, and I promise you." "I'm not finished," she said, and her voice did not raise, and she did not step back. "For 18 months, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit has been building a case against you, Deputy Chief. They have your financial records, they have the bank accounts, they have the communications. What they needed was one thing: you on record using your office to obstruct a legitimate civil rights arrest." She paused. "You just ordered me to destroy a booking log and release a suspect in a civil rights case. In this room. In front of this room." Cole went still. Not the stillness of control, the stillness of a man who has just heard something that stops the brain's forward motion completely, that requires a full reboot before it can be processed. His eyes moved with the slow, involuntary tracking of a man following a sound he didn't want to identify down to the small, rectangular device on Nadia's left lapel. "You wore a wire," he said. "You handed me the rope," she said. "You tied the noose yourself." And the front doors of the 31st Precinct opened a second time. The arrests, the fallout, the viral explosion, and the slow dismantling of everything Bellamy and Cole built. They came in quietly, which was somehow worse than loudly would have been. 5 federal agents in dark suits and blue windbreakers with FBI in yellow across the back, moving through the lobby of the 31st Precinct with the unhurried, complete authority of people who have done exactly this before and know how it ends. And at their front was Special Agent Diane Forsyth, a woman in her mid-40s in a charcoal blazer with the particular bearing of someone who has been building toward this specific moment for 18 months and is now delivering it with the precision of a surgeon, making an incision she has practiced in her mind 1,000 times. Forsyth had a sealed arrest warrant in her right hand. She walked directly to Warren Cole. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene of it because she didn't need to, because the scene was already made, because the 40-odd officers and clerks and detectives of the 31st Precinct were all watching, and the watching was the scene. She recited the charges: obstruction of justice, witness tampering, conspiracy to deprive, civil rights violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. In the flat, factual tone of a document being read into a record, which was exactly what it was, and she produced the handcuffs with the efficiency of someone completing a task, and Warren Cole. Deputy Chief of Police, a man who had walked into rooms like this one for 30 years as the most powerful person in them, turned around and placed his wrists behind his back. His aides scattered. 2 of them moved immediately toward the door, and nobody stopped them because they weren't the target, and they had just seen what happened to the target. And fear is a very fast teacher. Cole said something as the cuffs went on. It was brief and not worth recording the last reflex of a man who has spent 30 years having the final word on everything, producing words, now because words were all he had left, and the words didn't land because there was no longer any surface for them to land on. Forsyth walked him toward the door. Two of her agents peeled off to begin the process of securing evidence computers, filing cabinets, the administrative infrastructure of a decade of protected misconduct that would keep them in the building for the next 6 hours. Sergeant Earl Briggs watched from his desk. He had been behind that desk for 25 years, watching things happen in this room. Some of them things he should have reported and hadn't. Some of them. Things he had told himself were not his business. Some of them things he had simply not allowed himself to fully see, because seeing them would have required him to do something about them, and he had built a very careful life around not doing that particular something. He watched Warren Cole being walked through the lobby of the 31st Precinct in handcuffs, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific exhausted relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't admit was a weight, and who is only now feeling it lift, and who is not proud of the fact that someone else had to lift it. Nadia stood at the top of the stairs and watched Cole go. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular quality of completion that is different from triumph, quieter, more internal, the feeling of something that needed to be done. Being done, the long, slow closing of a door that should have been closed years ago and wasn't. And all the cost of that delay accounted for in the faces of the people whose complaints had gone nowhere, and whose lives had been shaped in small and large ways by the specific cruelty of a system that was supposed to protect them and didn't. She turned to face the room. 50 officers, detectives, clerks, the duty desk staff, the patrolmen from the shift change who had wandered in to see what the noise was, all of them watching her with the expressions of people who have just watched their entire institutional world reorganized in the space of a Tuesday morning and are waiting to find out what the new world is going to require of them. She did not give them a speech. She gave them 3 sentences. "You took an oath," she said. "This precinct is going to start honoring it, beginning today." She turned back to her office. There was work to do. Marcus Webb had uploaded it from the sidewalk outside Holt and Wren 40 seconds after Bellamy's cruiser pulled away. He hadn't debated it. He hadn't waited to see what happened next or consulted anyone or thought through the implications. He had grown up in the flats, which meant he had learned very early that there are moments when the most important thing you can do is create a record that can survive outside the moment itself, because the moment will be managed and the story will be adjusted, and the people with the authority to define what happened will define it in ways that serve the people with the authority unless there is something that cannot be adjusted. He uploaded it. He tagged the department's public accountability page, 2 local news outlets, and 6 people in his phone contacts who he knew had large followings. Within 4 hours, 11 million people had watched a uniformed police officer grab a black woman from behind in a luxury store, march her out in handcuffs while she stood tall and said nothing, and transport her to a precinct for a crime that had not occurred. The video was 9 minutes and 40 seconds long. It was shot from Marcus's personal phone from behind the accessories counter, which meant the angle was slightly low and the audio was slightly compressed but entirely intelligible. Every word Bellamy said, every response Nadia gave, and one moment near the 3-minute mark where Bellamy leaned in close to her and said something in a lowered voice, and the quality of Nadia's response to it, her stillness, the way she absorbed it without giving him anything in return, carried in the video a weight that did not require the words themselves to be heard clearly. People in comments described what they were seeing in different ways, but what they were all describing was the same thing: the look on her face. The absolute unbroken dignity of a woman who is being treated as if she is nothing, and who is responding with the bearing of someone who has never once believed that, who has carried herself for 47 years as exactly who she is and who is not, about to renegotiate that just because Craig Bellamy has his hand on her arm. People recognized something in that. It moved in them. A 61-year-old black woman in Memphis watched it in her living room and sat with her hands folded in her lap for a long time after it ended, and she recognized the look on Nadia's face as the look she had been practicing her whole life. A retired police sergeant in Columbus watched it and felt a cold, sick clarity settle in his chest because he recognized what he was seeing from the inside, and he watched it to the end and then went and sat in the driveway in his car for half an hour. A 19-year-old in the Halcyon Heights flats texted the link to 6 friends in the first 30 seconds after he saw it, and his message was just the link and a single word, "watch," because the context was already there because you didn't need to explain to someone in the flats what they were looking at. The DA's office made a decision within 20 hours, full transparency. Kowalski's body cam footage, all of it including the audio from the cruiser interior, was released to the press. The store security footage from 3 separate cameras in Holt and Wren followed 12 hours after that. The slur was audible on the body cam audio. The police union issued a statement expressing support for Officer Bellamy and confidence in the department's review process, which was destroyed by the union's own attorney the following morning, when the attorney listened to the audio and the union went quiet. The arrest of Warren Cole broke nationally as the second wave of the story, a corruption story layered over a racial profiling story, layered over a story about a black woman in a hoodie who had turned out to be the commanding officer of the precinct that arrested her, and the layering of it, the specific way each element compounded the one. Before produced the kind of national conversation that usually burns itself out in 48 hours. But in this case kept finding new fuel. In the Halcyon Heights flats on the block where Nadia had watched the young man step off the sidewalk that morning, 3 people taped a printed photograph to a utility pole. It was the frame grab from the video, Nadia, hands behind her back, head up, walking out of Holt and Wren. Underneath it, in marker, someone had written, "She knew who she was." The afternoon light came through the single high window of holding cell 3, in a narrow angle that moved across the opposite wall as the hours passed, and Craig Bellamy tracked it without meaning to, the way you track the only moving thing in a very small room. And by the time it had crossed to the far edge of the wall and begun to go gray with the early evening, he had been through everything. He had been through the first hour of flat disbelief, not the dramatic disbelief of a movie scene, but the specific low-grade cognitive refusal of a mind that has been operating inside a particular story for a very long time and cannot process information that requires the story to be wrong. He had replayed the booking room, the badge wallet, the floor, and arrived each time at the same place, which was that it was impossible and that there was an explanation that didn't require what it appeared to require. He had been through the rage also. Not dramatic, mostly internal, the specific fury of someone who has built his entire identity around being the one who puts other people in cells, and who is now in the cell, and who keeps reaching for the institutional protection he has always had and finding air. He had been through the bargaining. His uncle was coming. His uncle would fix this. His uncle had always fixed this. And then his union rep had arrived. Patrick Greer was a heavy-set man in a golf shirt who had spent 11 years protecting officers from the consequences of their behavior, and who had a certain comfortable pragmatism about his work that Bellamy had always found reassuring. Greer pulled up a metal folding chair on the other side of the bars and sat in it with his elbows on his knees and his face doing something it had never done before in any of their previous interactions, which was expressing something very close to resignation. He told Bellamy about the body cam audio. He told him specifically about the section of the audio where Bellamy's voice, the voice of a man who had apparently never given a single thought to the audio pickup range of a cruiser interior microphone, said clearly and without ambiguity the thing he had leaned in and said at the accessories counter of Holt and Wren. Bellamy said that the audio was being taken out of context. Greer told him it was a continuous recording with no break, no edit, and 3 independent forensic certifications already in the chain of custody. Bellamy said that wasn't what it sounded like, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Greer told him he might want to talk to an attorney about what he meant and not to a union rep, and that the union was withdrawing from active representation of this case, effective immediately, and that this decision was irreversible. The silence after Greer left was of a different quality than the silence before. Before the silence had been the impatient silence of waiting for his uncle, waiting for the process that had always resolved these things to resolve this thing. After Greer left, the silence was the silence of a man who has run out of waiting and is left with what's actually there. His uncle was in federal custody. He asked the duty officer to let him use the phone. His one call, the one he had been assigned as a right that he had assigned to others as an act of procedural compliance many times in 7 years that he was now on the receiving end of. He sat with the phone for a moment, running through who to call. He called his mother. She picked up on the second ring because she had been watching the phone since the video started circulating, because she had recognized him the way mothers recognize their children, even in the worst versions of themselves, and she was crying before he said hello. And hearing her cry was the thing that finally broke through the layers of denial and calculation and performance, because whatever else Craig Bellamy had become over 7 years, there had been a person before the years and the badge and the uncle's protection, and the person who had been before all of it had a mother, and the mother was on the phone crying. He didn't know what to say. He said her name. She said his. He said he was sorry, and he wasn't sure in the moment of saying it whether he was sorry for what he had done or sorry for what was happening to him as a result of it. And he was not yet in a place to examine the difference, but he said it. That night, alone in the cell with the overhead light on its automated schedule and the sounds of the precinct carrying faintly through the walls, he lay on the bunk and looked at the ceiling and replayed the moment the badge wallet hit the floor and the sound of Kowalski's voice answering 3 questions and the quality of the silence in the booking room in the seconds after. He lay there for a very long time with no uniform and no badge and no uncle and no story left to tell himself, just the ceiling and the sound of the ventilation and the specific stripped-down, inescapable weight of what he had made of himself. 3 days later. The 31st precinct looked the same from the outside, same brick, same flag. The flag was new. Actually, a small thing that nobody had announced, a new flag that the facilities officer had quietly ordered and installed because someone had finally filed the maintenance request, same parking lot, same door. Inside, it felt different in the way that rooms feel different after the load-bearing element has been removed and the structure is holding itself differently in the air. 6 officers with direct documented ties to Cole's network were on administrative leave. 2 had retained attorneys within 48 hours. A third had reached out to the FBI's public corruption unit through his attorney, not with full cooperation, but with what his attorney described as a willingness to discuss a timeline, which was the diplomatic language for the beginning of the end. Nadia had spent the 3 days doing the work that nobody sees and that doesn't make the news, reviewing cases, personnel files, complaint, logs, the paper trail of what the 31st had actually been doing for the past 10 years in its official records versus what it had been doing in its actual practice, which were 2 different things that the paperwork had been carefully maintained to make look like one thing. She called Briggs into her office on day 3. He came in and stood in front of her desk with the posture of someone who has prepared himself for a specific kind of conversation and is not sure how to begin it. She didn't make him begin it. She told him she had read the full personnel file of every officer on the duty roster, and she had read his, and she was not here to conduct a loyalty tribunal. She was here to run a precinct, and she needed to know whether the people she was running it with were going to do the job or not. Briggs sat down. He didn't make excuses. He didn't list the years and the pressures and the calculations he had made because she already knew them and because he was old enough and tired enough to know that listing them would be the kind of thing that sounds like honesty but is actually another form of protection. He asked her what she needed from him. She told him. He nodded. She called Kowalski in separately. He came in his uniform, off patrol, assigned to desk, pending the investigation's formal review of his role in the day's events. He was 26, and he looked older than he had 6 months ago. which was what 6 months of partnership with Craig Bellamy had done to him, and he sat in the chair across from her desk with his hands in his lap and said nothing while she looked at his file. The voluntary statement he had submitted to the FBI ran 14 pages. He had been awake for 27 hours when he finished writing it. He had documented everything: the locker room stories, the profile stops, the flats patrols, the Devon incident, the Kezia Armstrong situation that he had not witnessed directly but had heard enough of to understand what had happened and had not reported. 14 pages of every time he had looked at the floor instead of up, every calculation that had gone the wrong way, every moment he had promised himself he would step in when it mattered and had not. She told him the desk assignment would continue through the formal review, but that the review would account for the testimony he had given. She told him the testimony he had given was the most important thing he had done in his 6 months on the force, which was a low bar, but was true, and that what he did with the rest of his career was up to him. She had personally contacted all 3 of the black officers who had requested transfers out of the 31st. She called each of them directly on their personal numbers without going through the department's standard communication channels. She told each of them the truth, not a sales pitch, not a performance of improvement, but the specific truth of what she had found when she arrived, and what she was doing about it, and what it was going to look like in 6 months, and what it might look like in a year if the work continued. She told them the door was open with no pressure and no timeline. 2 said they would think about it. The third one, Officer Raymond Douglas, a 12-year veteran who had requested his transfer after the second complaint he filed about a Bellamy incident was returned to him unreviewed, said something that Nadia wrote down and kept. He said, "When are you going to need me?" She told him she could use him right now. He said he'd come in Monday. 6 months later, the federal courthouse on Garrison Street was the kind of building that announces itself before you are anywhere near it. The broad marble steps, the brass doors, the carved inscription above the entrance that nobody reads anymore, but that still does its work on you as you walk under it, reminding you that you are entering a space where the language of consequence is the official language, where what people do is held up to what they said they would do, and the distance between those 2 things is measured. The gallery was full. It had been full since the doors opened at 8. The case had national attention, which meant the rows behind the bar were split between families of people who had been processed through the 31st's particular brand of justice over the years, and journalists, and the simply attentive. The kind of people who sit in courtrooms because they believe that what happens in courtrooms matters, which is a belief that requires a certain kind of willingness to keep having it. Craig Bellamy sat at the defense table in a gray suit that had been expensive when he bought it and now seemed to belong to a larger man. He had lost 22 pounds in the 6 months since the arrest, not dramatically, not visibly collapsed, just progressively, quietly reduced the way things reduce when the thing that was sustaining them is removed. He had cut his hair shorter than the high and tight he had maintained for 7 years, and without it he looked different in a way that was hard to specify. Younger in some ways and older in others. Like a costume had been removed, and what was underneath was still figuring out what it was without it. His attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Rebecca Torres, who was exhausted and thorough, and whose particular form of professionalism was to prepare with complete honesty about what her cases could and could not produce, had gone over the evidence with him 6 times, and each time they went over it, she watched him search for the angle that made it possible, the technical argument that would reframe the audio, the procedural objection that would pull one load-bearing element out of the prosecution's structure and bring the whole thing down, and each time she watched him arrive at the end of the search with nothing. The defense had 2 arguments. The first was that the racial slur on the body cam audio was misheard or misidentified, or taken out of context, and that Bellamy had not used it, and that the prosecution's version of events was incorrect. This argument had been evaluated by 3 independent audio forensics experts from 3 separate firms, all of whom produced identical transcriptions, and it had been preemptively destroyed before the trial began. The second was that Bellamy had been conducting legitimate, proactive policing based on behavioral indicators, and that the arrest was procedurally defensible even if imperfect. This argument required the jury to disbelieve Danny Kowalski and Marcus Webb and the body cam footage and the store security footage and the patrol guide itself, which Torres had told Bellamy with quiet directness was not going to happen. Kowalski was the first witness. He walked to the stand with the slightly too upright posture of someone performing composure because they need it dressed in full uniform. His body camera absent for the first time since he'd been issued it because the camera was in evidence. He sat down. He placed his hands on the railing of the witness box. He looked once at Bellamy and then at the prosecutor, and he answered every question in the steady voice of a man who has been rehearsing in his sleep for 6 months, not rehearsing a performance, but rehearsing the truth, going over it again and again until it sat in him solidly enough to survive the pressure of the formal saying of it. He described the morning from the beginning. He described the idling on Cartwright Avenue, the view through the store window, the 2 words Bellamy said before he was out of the car. Watch this. He described his own half-step forward in the store and his own stopping, and he described it without softening it or framing it in his own defense, just stated it as what it was, which was a moment when he chose wrong and knew it, and kept choosing wrong until he couldn't anymore. The jury watched him with the particular attention of people who are deciding how much to trust someone. Measuring the testimony against something internal, and what they seemed to be measuring it against was the specific quality of a person telling the truth about himself in the most unflattering possible terms, because that kind of testimony has a texture that performed testimony doesn't have. Marcus Webb was next. He was 23, and he was nervous. His hands moved on the railing more than Kowalski's had. But his testimony was the simplest thing in the room because it was the plainest account of what had happened, given by someone who had no institutional involvement, no career to protect, no story to construct. He had been at work. A woman had come in and asked to see a pen. An officer had come in and grabbed her. He had heard what the officer said when he leaned in close. He had filmed it. That was all. He answered the defense's cross-examination, which attempted with limited success to suggest that his memory of the slur was reconstructed from the subsequent public discussion rather than directly witnessed with the simple, repeated confirmation that he had heard it, he had been 4 feet away, and he was not confused about it. Nadia took the stand last. She wore her Class A uniform. She carried herself in the particular way that very competent people carry themselves in rooms that are trying to determine their credibility, which is with complete stillness, no performing of confidence, no visible management of the situation, just the natural posture of someone who has been in difficult rooms before and who treats this room the way she treats all rooms, as a place where the work happens. She answered every question factually, chronologically, without drama, in the precise language of a 22-year veteran describing an incident, and the drama was entirely in the facts themselves, in the sequence of events, in the documented violations, in the specific language of the patrol guide, read against the specific events of the arrest in the body cam audio, played for the jury with the slur isolated and the transcript printed in the jury materials. She did not express anger. She did not editorialize. She stated what had happened in the order. It happened in the language of someone who understands that truth, stated plainly, is more powerful than truth stated with emphasis. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. Guilty on false imprisonment. Guilty on assault under color of authority. Guilty on deprivation of civil rights. Guilty on official misconduct. Bellamy sat at the defense table and looked at the table when the verdicts were read, and Torres put her hand on his arm in the way defense attorneys put their hands on their clients' arms when there is nothing left to say. And after a moment, he nodded, which was not acceptance so much as the final acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time. Warren Cole had entered a partial plea agreement at month 4 when the RICO case was fully assembled, and his defense attorney, a genuinely excellent criminal defense lawyer who had reviewed the evidence with the thorough objectivity of someone billing by the hour, had advised him with complete clarity that proceeding to a full trial on all counts would produce a longer sentence for a certainty rather than a shorter one for a possibility. Cole had not taken this advice with grace. He had taken it the way powerful men take advice they don't want to hear when they have finally run out of the ability to dismiss it, which is with a specific contained fury that presents itself as strategic consideration. He had pled guilty to obstruction of justice and 1 count of conspiracy to deprive civil rights while contesting the remaining RICO counts. A decision that his attorney had been honest with him was unlikely to produce the result he was hoping for. The remaining counts were tried in 4 days. The evidence was read into the record in the specific cumulative way that federal cases present pattern evidence. Not one dramatic revelation, but a sequence of documented actions, each one individually arguable together, forming something that was no longer arguable. 11 civil rights complaints submitted against officers under Cole's purview, all 11 reviewed and found unsubstantiated by a board Cole chaired. 2 officers reassigned under false pretexts within 30 days of filing internal reports about misconduct, the employment records, the timing, the documented chain of communication between their supervisors and Cole's office. The financial records showing a shell company receiving quarterly deposits from a source. The forensic accountants had traced through 3 intermediate accounts to a law firm that had settled 6 excessive force claims against the 31st precinct claims that Cole had personally certified were settled without admission of liability, while the city paid and the officers returned to duty. And then the audio. His own voice in the booking area of the 31st precinct in the specific sequence of the conversation with Nadia that had been recorded on federal equipment, ordering the destruction of a booking log, threatening a commanding officer, attempting to release a suspect in a civil rights arrest using his institutional authority. Cole sat in the defendant's chair through the reading of the evidence with the expression of a man who has done something so many times in a world that rewarded him for it that he genuinely had not understood until now that the world could stop rewarding it. Not the expression of remorse. Remorse requires a recognition of wrong that precedes consequence. And Cole had not had that recognition. Had not had it when he buried the first complaint, or the 5th, or the 11th, had not had it when he reassigned the whistleblowers, had not had it when he walked into the 31st precinct to have Nadia's command revoked. He was experiencing consequence without, as yet, the interior architecture that would make consequence meaningful. Nobody from the department came to support him. His wife was not in the gallery, guilty on 4 federal counts. Judge Patricia Okafor had been on the federal bench for 16 years. She had grown up 2 miles from the Halcyon Heights flats, in a house that was still standing on a street that had been in the 31st Precinct's patrol territory for as long as the 31st had existed, which meant she had grown up in the specific ambient knowledge of what it meant to live in a neighborhood where the quality of law enforcement was determined by which side of the invisible line you were on. She had gone to law school on a scholarship and had clerked and had practiced and had been appointed and had presided for 16 years over cases of many kinds, and she was known among defense attorneys and prosecutors alike for a particular quality in her courtroom, which was that she was constitutionally incapable of pretending that consequences were abstract. She believed that what happened to people was real, and that the decisions she made from the bench were part of the chain of cause and effect that produced what happened to people. And she presided over sentencing hearings with the specific gravity of someone who understood that the measured language of the law was not a buffer between herself and that reality, but a tool for engaging with it precisely. Bellamy was brought in from holding. He stood at the defense table in the ill-fitting gray suit flanked by Torres, who had prepared the standard mitigation package with the thorough resignation of someone who has done this before. for people who did not have mitigation that would move a federal judge on this kind of charge. The package contained first offense cooperation with investigation, partial reluctant, and primarily consisting of not obstructing the federal case after it became clear that obstruction was no longer possible. Documented personal history, the testimony of his mother. Bellamy had been given the opportunity to speak. He stood up. He was thinner than he had been at trial, and more still the constant physical animation that had characterized him in every room he had ever been in had gone very quiet, as if the thing that had driven it had been removed and the body didn't know yet what to run on instead. He began to speak, and he said, "I made a mistake." And Okafor let him continue for 2 minutes without interrupting, and then she spoke. She told him the phrase, "I made a mistake," was doing something very specific in his statement, which was implying that what had happened was a departure from who he was rather than a revelation of it. She told him that the evidence did not support that interpretation, that the pattern of his 7-year record at the 31st showed not a man who made a mistake on a Tuesday morning in October, but a man who had made a consistent series of choices, each one reinforced by the absence of consequence. Each one made possible by the presence of institutional protection that had shielded him from accountability long past the point at which accountability would have been corrective rather than merely punitive. She told him that the people whose complaints had gone nowhere, whose nights had been shaped by what he had done to them, whose lives carried small and large marks from their encounters with Craig Bellamy, those people had also deserved the protection of the law, and they had not received it. And the sentencing before her today was partial restitution for that debt, which was the most the law could offer. She told him she hoped in the years ahead he would find his way to the kind of understanding that his statement today suggested he had not yet reached. Then she read the sentence. 11 years in a federal correctional institution. Permanent revocation of pension, permanent bar from serving in any law enforcement capacity anywhere in the United States, in any role at any level. Bail revoked. Immediate remand. The bailiffs moved forward. Bellamy put his wrists together and the cuffs went on the same flat mechanical click that he had used to close cuffs on other people's wrists hundreds of times in 7 years, and he was turned toward the door and walked out of the courtroom, and Torres collected her files and the gallery began the slow, exhaling process of dispersal that follows the completion of something long awaited. In the third row of the gallery, Nadia sat with her notebook open on her lap. She closed it. She looked at the door Bellamy had gone through. She thought about Devon on Meridian Street and Kezia Armstrong and the 3 people who had taped the photograph to the utility pole in the flats. She thought about the static sound in her brother's left ear. Warren Cole was sentenced 3 hours later in the same courtroom before the same judge. He received 14 years. RICO obstruction conspiracy. Pension forfeited. A man who had spent 30 years building an architecture of protection and authority was handed 14 years to sit inside the wreckage of it. Okafor read his sentence with the same precision she had applied to Bellamy's. Not performance, not editorial, just the language of consequence delivered with the specificity it deserved. And when the gavel came down, Cole sat in his chair for a moment, before the marshals moved forward, and in that moment he wore the expression of a man confronting for the first time the full dimensions of what he had built and what it had cost the people. It had been built on top of, and whether that recognition was genuine or merely the recognition of loss, whether it was remorse or just devastation, was something that only the 14 years ahead of him would answer. Nadia watched him go. She stood up, put her notebook in her bag, and walked out of the courtroom. She had a 9 o'clock roll call tomorrow, and there were 3 budget reviews on her desk, and Officer Raymond Douglas had come in on Monday and was proving to be exactly what she'd hoped, and Kowalski had submitted a request to return to patrol duty that she was going to approve with conditions, and Sergeant Briggs had been doing something she hadn't asked him to do. which was quietly mentoring two of the newest officers on the desk about the difference between covering for your colleagues and actually standing behind them, which were not the same thing, which Briggs had learned very recently at a cost that he clearly intended to spend the rest of his career making worthwhile. She walked out into the Garrison Street afternoon. The light was the light of a November evening, low and clear and cold. She took a breath of it. She kept walking. You could measure the change in the small things if you knew what to look for. The three burned-out lights in the back parking lot had been replaced within Nadia's first week, a maintenance request filed, processed, and completed, which sounds unremarkable, but which every person at the 31st understood as a signal of a different kind, because the lights had been out for 4 months and the filing of a maintenance request had been under the previous order, a quiet way of marking yourself as someone who didn't understand how things worked, and now it was just filing a maintenance request, which was what maintenance requests were for. The American flag above the entrance was new. The framed photographs in the lobby had a 23rd frame now, with a brass nameplate that said Captain Nadia Monroe, and a photograph in which she looked directly into the camera with the expression of someone who has done a lot of things and is ready to do more, and the empty frame that had been waiting at the end of the row for 11 days was full. Danny Kowalski was back on patrol. He had completed the formal review process and returned to active duty with a new partner. A 5-year veteran named Sandra Osei, who had come over from the 7th Precinct, and who had, in the 4 months they'd been working together, produced in Kowalski a version of himself that was better than the one he'd been developing under Bellamy's supervision, because Osei was the kind of cop who had not learned to make the calculation about when the right thing was worth doing, because she had simply decided very early that it was always worth doing and had organized her career around that decision without much drama. Kowalski was learning from her. It was uncomfortable in the way real learning always is, and he was doing it anyway. He was not a hero. He did not carry himself like one. What he was 1 year later was a 27-year-old man who had been given an opportunity to be something he was not yet sure he could be, and who was trying with genuine effort to become it. Raymond Douglas had been promoted to detective. He was working out of the 31st assigned to the Flats district, and in the 4 months since his promotion, he had closed more cases than the previous detective assigned to that beat had closed in a year and a half, which was not simply a function of Raymond's ability, but also a function of the change in the neighborhood's relationship to the precinct. The incremental, fragile, still-being-earned shift in what happened when a detective from the 31st knocked on a door in the Flats and asked if anyone had seen anything, which was that more people were beginning to answer because the answer was beginning to feel like it might go somewhere. Sergeant Earl Briggs had not retired. He had considered it seriously, had filled out the paperwork twice, both times, stopping at the signature line, and each time he had stopped for the same reason, which was that there were 2 junior officers he had started talking to informally, at the end of their shifts, conversations that had begun as nothing particular and had developed into something he couldn't quite name, but recognized as important. The passing of a specific kind of knowledge, hard-won and expensive, about the difference between institutional loyalty and actual integrity, about the things that a long career in a compromised place could do to a person who didn't watch it carefully, about what it looked like from the inside when a place started to go wrong and what you could actually do about it if you chose to. He didn't know if it was enough, the talking. He suspected it wasn't enough on its own. But he had decided that doing the thing he could do imperfectly and late was better than the alternative, which was leaving. Marcus Webb had received a commendation from Commissioner Park, a formal letter on department stationery signed and dated, citing his civic courage in documenting the incident at Holt and Wren. He had framed it and put it on the wall of his apartment between a photograph of his grandmother and a print he liked. And he went to work every Tuesday morning and unlocked the accessories counter at Holt and Wren and stood behind the glass and helped people find what they were looking for. And some mornings now, when officers from the 31st came in on their lunch break or on errands, they nodded to him by name and he nodded back. And it was not a large thing, but it was a different thing than what had been there before. And Marcus Webb, who had grown up in the flats and had learned very young to read the meaning in small things, understood the difference. It was a Tuesday morning in October 1 year and 4 days after the Tuesday morning that had changed everything, and the light coming through the window of the commanding officer's office of the 31st Precinct was the same low, clean October light that had been coming through windows all over Halcyon Heights on that day. And Nadia was at her desk with her coffee and a file open in front of her, which was how most of her mornings began. She picked up her phone and called her brother. He picked up on the third ring, which was usual. He had a daughter who was 8 months old now, and he kept his phone across the room during naps in case the sound woke her, and then didn't always hear it until the third ring. She could hear in the background the specific muffled quality of an apartment where someone is trying to be quiet and the small background noises of a morning happening. She asked how he was. He said, good tired, that the baby had discovered she disliked Tuesdays specifically, which he had been trying to confirm for 3 weeks and was now reasonably sure about. She laughed. She asked about his job, which he had started in the spring doing project management for a non-profit that worked on housing advocacy in the flats, which was a job he had found after a long time of looking for something that felt like it connected to something real and which had turned out to be exactly that. He asked how the precinct was going. She thought about the maintenance requests and the framed photographs and Raymond Douglas's clearance rate and the 2 junior officers Briggs was talking to after shifts, and Kowalski learning something true from Sandra Osei and the photograph taped to the utility pole in the flats. She said it was going. She did not call it a transformation because she had been in this work long enough to know that the word transformation described a moment, and what she was doing was not a moment. It was a direction which required every day to be faced as a direction and not as an achievement. There were officers on the roster she was still evaluating. There were patterns that had been set over 10 years that were going to take longer than 12 months to replace with different patterns. There were residents in the flats who had been carrying distrust for so long that Nadia would never personally earn their trust back, and who would require whoever came after her to keep earning it, which was fine, which was how it was supposed to work. She thought about a moment from the previous week that she had been turning over in her mind since it happened. She had been doing a community walkthrough in the flats. She did one every 2 weeks on foot without much advance notice, and she had been passing a block on Meridian Street, the same Meridian Street where Devon had walked home from his grocery store shift and ended up on the ground. And an older woman had been coming out of her building carrying 2 bags of groceries and had stopped when she saw Nadia and had looked at her for a moment with the cautious, evaluating look of someone who has learned to read the difference between institutional representatives who mean what they say and institutional representatives who don't. And then the woman had said simply, "You're the captain, right?" From the 31st, and Nadia had said yes, and the woman had nodded once, a small economic nod that carried a full sentence's worth of meaning in the single downward motion, a nod that said, "I see you. And I'm watching. And I am not yet convinced. But I am not yet not convinced either, and showing up is a start." And she had turned and walked away with her groceries. That nod. Nadia had carried it for a week. She carried it because she understood what it cost the woman to give it, understood the weight of the accumulated history of all the times trust had been extended and used up. And she understood that the nod was not approval, it was not forgiveness, it was not an endorsement. It was the first step in a process that would take years and would require consistency that she would have to build and maintain and pass on to whoever came after her. It was the most important thing that had happened in her first year at the 31st. She put her phone back on the desk. She finished her coffee. She looked at the clock. Roll call in 11 minutes. She stood up. Craig Bellamy was in his second year at a federal correctional institution in western Pennsylvania, which was not the minimum security facility that the lawyers he could no longer afford had once suggested might be possible, given certain favorable case outcomes that had not materialized. It was a medium security facility in a long valley between two ridges where the light in the early morning came in at an angle that reminded you immediately that you were inside, because the windows were designed to admit light without admitting perspective. He shared a cell with a man named Gerald, who was in his 5th year and who had absolutely no interest in Craig Bellamy's story, former occupation, or opinions, and who communicated this disinterest with the clear, uncomplicated efficiency of someone with 4 years of practice living in a small space with people he had not chosen. This was more information than Bellamy had wanted, but also in a way he was still working out more useful than the alternative would have been. In the institution, nobody cared that he had been a cop, except in the specific and particular way that people in a medium-security federal facility care about former law enforcement, which was that it gave him a category and a reputation that he had no way to manage that existed independent of anything he did or said, and that he could not fix with family connections or institutional authority because he did not have family connections or institutional authority anymore. He had a lot of time. The thought that came back most often was not about the trial or the badge wallet or the moment in the booking room when Briggs's hands couldn't find the cuff key. It was about Kowalski's face. Specifically, the expression on Kowalski's face in the 3 seconds after Bellamy turned to him in the booking room and told him to keep his mouth shut. The specific, exhausted expression of a 26-year-old man at the end of a long process of deciding something, an expression that was not anger and was not fear and was not satisfaction at doing the right thing, but was the expression of someone who has been carrying the weight of a bad choice for a long time and has finally put it down. And the exhaustion of that release was right there on his face. And Bellamy had read it as betrayal, and now, in the long, uninterrupted hours of a federal correctional institution, he was beginning to understand that what it actually was Kowalski choosing to remain a person. He did not arrive at clarity about himself in these pages. That was not how it worked. But he sat with the thought, and sitting with it was the beginning of something, and the beginning was all he had. Warren Cole was in a minimum security facility in Virginia. The visible markers of who he had been were gone. The suit, the rank, the deference of people who needed things from him. And without them, he was a 59-year-old man with 14 years ahead of him, and a very long and thorough accounting to sit with. He had not been visited by anyone from the department. He had received one letter from his nephew, brief and factual, that contained no warmth and no accusation, just the news that Bellamy had been transferred to a different facility and was by his own account getting through it. The letter contained the information Cole needed, and nothing more, which was also in its own way the whole story of what had happened between them. 6 weeks after sentencing, Nadia walked into Holt and Wren. She was in her Class A uniform this time, which had an entirely different effect on the room than the navy hoodie and jogger pants of 13 months ago. The security guard near the entrance nodded. The floor associate in the fitted black suit made brief, pleasant eye contact. The acoustics of the store received her with the same cedar and leather. Quiet they always had, unchanged because the store was the same store and the light was the same light. And October was doing the same thing it did every year to the air of Cartwright Avenue. Marcus Webb was behind the accessories counter. He saw her come through the door, and he went still for a half-second. Not the cautious, calculating stillness of 13 months ago, but the stillness of recognition of a man who has been part of something and is seeing one of the other people who were part of it walk back into the room where it started. Then he smiled, which was a real smile, the uncomplicated kind. She told him she was here to buy the pen. He unlocked the case. He removed the Mont Blanc Meisterstück she had originally asked to see, the one that retired Captain Lionel Grant, who had turned 74 weeks after his birthday, was supposed to have been celebrated and had instead been celebrated 6 weeks late over dinner at a restaurant where Nadia had apologized for the delay, and Grant had looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been following the news and said, "Nadia, I think you were a little busy." And they had both laughed in the way that people laugh when they have earned the right to the one that had been sitting in the case for 13 months unsold, because Marcus had quietly put a small adhesive dot on the base of the display stand after the day in question, and nobody had bought it, and he wasn't sure exactly why he'd done that, except that it had seemed right to leave it. She bought it. It was wrapped carefully in tissue and placed in a small, branded box. They talked for a few minutes, easy, unhurried, the conversation of two people who don't need to explain the context to each other because the context is already there. He told her the video still got comments every week. She said she knew. He told her the neighborhood felt different. She told him it was going to keep changing. He nodded. She walked out of Holt and Wren onto Cartwright Avenue. It was a brisk October morning, the light clean and directional, the air carrying the specific early autumn quality that makes everything look slightly more outlined than usual, more vivid at the edges. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the small gift box in her hand and the street in front of her. A young black woman came around the corner from Meridian Street, maybe 22, 23. In a hoodie and jogger pants, earbuds in moving with the particular purpose of someone who has somewhere to be and is not rushing but is also not wasting time. She slowed briefly when she passed the window of Holt and Wren, glancing at the display, and then kept walking. A patrol car from the 31st turned onto Cartwright from the south end of the block. Nadia watched. The car slowed near the curb. The window came down. The officer behind the wheel, young of face she recognized from roll call, 2 months on patrol, leaned out slightly and called to the young woman. The young woman turned, pulling one earbud out with the specific guardedness of someone who has had enough experience with patrol cars, stopping near her to know that this moment could go several different ways. The officer said there was a craft fair on the 1400 block of Meridian that had closed the east side of the street, so if she was heading that way, Archer Street was faster this time of morning. The young woman looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thanks." She changed direction at the next intersection. The patrol car eased forward and continued up Cartwright. Nadia stood on the sidewalk in the October light with Captain Lionel Grant's retirement gift in her hand, and she felt something in her chest shift, not disappear, because the thing in her chest had accumulated over too many years and too many incidents, and one brother's partial hearing loss, and 11 buried complaints, and Devon on the pavement on Meridian Street to simply disappear but loosen fractionally the way a long-held breath finally releases. The way something held too tight for too long is finally allowed to rest. It wasn't fixed. She had no illusions about fixed. What it was different, and different in this direction was the thing she had given the last year of her life to, and it was enough for today, and tomorrow she would come back and give the next day to it. She put the gift box in her bag. She checked her watch. She had a 9 o'clock roll call and 3 budget reviews, and Officer Douglas's latest case report waiting on her desk, and Kowalski had asked for a meeting to discuss some concerns about a situation in the flats that he had been watching for 2 weeks and wanted to bring to her attention rather than waiting for it to become something. She walked to her car. The October morning held its breath for a moment, and then it kept going the way mornings do, carrying everything forward into the next hour, and the one after that, and the one after that. If this story moved you, if you recognized something in it, if it reminded you of the difference between what authority is supposed to be and what it sometimes becomes, and of the people who spend their lives working to close that distance, we'd be grateful if you'd like and share it, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. New stories every week, stories about justice, about accountability, about the people who refuse to be diminished. We'll see you in the next one.